Cruise news time. Well, an exciting day yesterday. We finally get something from the CDC. We finally get the technical instructions we're waiting for to move to the next phase. And it's a challenge, but let me tell you, it's not as bad as you think. I think we're closer to cruising than many are suspecting. And something interesting came out of those documents. The biggest thing that blew my mind yesterday is how the CDC thinks about cruise ships, and they think of them like they're prisons. How about that? Crazy. Let's talk about it. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Lido Loca. I'm your host, Tony, here with the latest cruise news updates. Well, there's only one update that I want to talk about, and that is the new CDC guidance. I tell you what, I've spent a lot of time reading the new guidance that came out, and man, just digesting it on, the first couple passes, you're like, wow, this is a lot of stuff, man. This is a lot of stuff. It sounds complicated, and so I had to take a break from it. I had to step back and say, okay, what's going on here? What is the deal? And then fortunately, I was over on the CDC's Twitter account, and they provided a nice infographic that has helped me process all of this. So let's use the infographic as our guide. I will throw it up on the screen right here. And the cool thing about this graphic is it shows the 4 phases of the conditional sail order, how we get from no sailing to sailing in the United States. Phase 1, mass testing and lab capacity building. The bullet points under there, they're short. Conduct screening testing of all crew on board. Develop onboard lab capacity for testing. Symptomatic crew, close contacts, and future passengers. Conduct embarkation testing of all crew. So basically phase 1, setting up how they're going to take care of things on the cruise ship, how they're going to get crew members on, how they're going to test them, and then what things are going to be in place when passengers come on to get them tested. We're done with phase 1. That's cause for celebration, and now we're just waiting, or we were waiting, on the instructions for phase 2. Well, they're calling phase 2 voyage preparation. Implement routine screening, testing of crew, develop port, medical, and housing agreements, and then after agreements are approved, embark non-essential crew, testing, and a 14-day quarantine. All right, let me jump in right here, and I will talk a little more in detail about the new information that we have. Fortunately, the CDC did a nice press release that kind of summarizes the more technical aspects of this. I'll leave a link to that in the pinned comment. But really, the thing that they clarified with the technical instructions yesterday are these things. They will be increasing from a weekly to a daily reporting of COVID-19 cases and illnesses. So right now on cruise ships, they are reporting weekly. If there's any illnesses, that's going to change to daily. That will continue once we get through this whole process. They're implementing routine testing of all crew based on each ship's color status. You know, the red, green, yellow we've been talking about all this time. It is important. Some people never thought it was important. You can't start cruising until your cruise ship is green. Updating the color coding system to classify ship status with respect to COVID-19. Decreasing the time needed for a red ship to become green. Normally that process taking 28 days. They're now going to do that in 14 days. Creating the planning materials for agreements that port authorities and local health authorities must approve. I'll say a little more about that in a second. And then establishing a plan and timeline for vaccination of crew and port personnel. So the big hurdle, the big rock to push up the hill in these 2A technical instructions is the cruise lines, they have to establish agreements with local port authorities and local health authorities around things like what happens if there's an outbreak, how many cruise ships can be in port at a time. The technical documents go really deep into saying all the things that these agreements must have in place. And feel free to read that. I will not describe all that to you. The big takeaway here, though, is of all the relationships that cruise lines have, I would say that some of the most favorable relationships they have are with port officials, port authorities, and I'm sure they've been working on their relationship with local health authorities. And so the cool thing about this, the CDC steps back and says it's up to you to go make agreements with your port cities. And we know from just watching the news over the last month or so that port cities are ready for cruising to start. So even though this seems like a lot of work, this is a lot of lawyer work. So these agreements will happen on paper between lawyers, that kind of thing. I think that will happen actually quicker than many people think. I don't think that that's such a long pole in the tent to put up. And so this is something that business does all the time. They make these agreements, and the outline of these agreements have been in place for a while. We're just finally getting the final technical instructions. So I think that the cruise lines will be able to move on this fairly quickly. The other new component is the consideration for vaccine. This did not exist in the conditional framework for sailing at all until yesterday. And now they're saying that they recommend the port personnel, they recommend that crew members are vaccinated, they recommend that passengers would be vaccinated, but they're not mandating it. I mean, that's important. However, to get to the next step, to get to phase 2B, the cruise lines have to have a plan around vaccination for crew, and around vaccination for passengers, and around vaccination for port personnel. So there's going to be some submission of vaccine plans to the CDC for them to either approve or not to approve, and that's how you get out of step 2B. But that's it. That's really all for 2B, except the CDC revealing that they think of cruise lines like prisons. I will follow that up, but let's get through the rest of the phases just so you understand the phases. And real quickly, if you're new here, if you enjoy this information about cruising, if you like being jacked into that cruise life, you got to subscribe. Please consider subscribing with the notification bell on. That way you don't miss out on any of these updates. Thank you in advance. All right, so like William Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. 2B is the thing that we want to see. 2B is the simulated trial passenger voyages. After you get through like phase 2A, then you got to request approval from the CDC to conduct simulated trial voyages. You have to complete the after action report. You have to have the voyage, and then you complete the after action report. Then you give all that to the CDC, and then you go to phase 3, where you actually apply for your certificate to go sailing, your conditional sail certificate. CDC makes sure that you've met all the requirements. They look at all your information from the test sailing. They make sure that all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, and then they give you permission to go to phase 4. And phase 4 is the restricted passenger voyage, restricted by time and restricted by capacity. And that means that you've met all the other qualifications. So honestly, I do think we could be closer to cruising than we think. If we can get these agreements in phase 2A done pretty quickly, then we can move on to simulated voyages. And after you get these simulated voyages going, then we're on to getting passengers going. So the path not as easy as we'd hoped for, especially when we heard information coming out yesterday about changes in international travel and domestic travel for vaccinated persons. It wasn't too hard to draw a line to say, well, cruising's international travel, and there's a domestic component, and if things are getting different or better for those things, then surely it's going to get better for cruising. I think many of us drew that line. But then digging into these technical instructions, I found out why that was not true. I found out why cruise lines are treated differently. Are you ready for the aha moment? Let's start here at the very detailed instructions, the technical instructions for the 2A instructions. If you look in the purpose, and if you go all the way to the next to the last paragraph in the purpose section, and there is this sentence, the very last sentence: for the purpose of these instructions, CDC considers cruise ships to constitute a residential congregate setting. Well, what the heck is a residential congregate setting? So I went and I looked at the health guidelines that came out yesterday for vaccinated people. So in the instructions for vaccinated people, we get to this section almost toward the bottom: fully vaccinated residents of non-healthcare congregate settings. And so non-healthcare congregate settings, I had to unpack that in my brain a little bit. Healthcare congregate settings would be like nursing homes, hospitals, treatment centers, anything that has a medical component. Those would be considered healthcare congregate settings. So what the heck is the non-healthcare? What is a residential congregate setting? Fully vaccinated residents of non-healthcare congregate settings. Example given: correctional and detention facilities, group homes, and I would add, based on what they said in the technical instructions, cruise ships should continue to quarantine for 14 days and be tested for SARS-CoV-2 following an exposure to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID-19. This is because residential congregate settings may face high turnover of residents, a higher risk of transmission, and challenges in maintaining recommended physical distancing. Boom, that's the Rosetta Stone. That's the secret code as to why cruise lines have been treated differently. Cruise lines not being treated as international travel, cruise lines being treated as residential congregate settings. And the characteristics of the residential congregate settings, Well, they sure do sound like a cruise ship. Now, you know, I don't think they're straight up calling it a prison, but the same thing that makes a prison have different rules seems to be the same things that are making cruise ships have different rules. High turnover of residents. In most cases, cruise lines turn over their residents, at least the passenger component, on a weekly basis. Higher risk of transmission. Yes, on a cruise ship, everybody is commingled in tight quarters. It's not super wide open. And so I think that, yes, that is a characteristic of a cruise ship. There is a higher risk of transmission. And then finally, challenges in maintaining recommended physical distancing. We know that is true also. If you've ever been on the promenade deck during any event that's happening on formal night, you know that it's hard to get some space on the cruise ship. And so that's it. I mean, that's cruise ships are like prisons, at least on those characteristics. And that's where the CDC is coming from. That's the mystery. So interesting stuff. At the end of the day, I continue to say I'm excited that the CDC said something, did something, gave something, opposed to doing nothing. It's not the easy button path we were hoping for, but it is a path forward. And so for that, I am grateful. I do see this as moving closer to cruising. And I really hope that my assumption is correct, that these agreements can be worked on fairly quickly because of the positive relationship between the cruise lines and local port authorities. And we will get on to test sailings. What do you think about that? Cruise ships like a prison. And what do you think about these new guidelines? And then hopefully that chart's helpful. I tell you, that chart's super helpful to me. I'm going to print it out and put it on my wall. Thank you so much for watching the show today. Do me a favor, smash that like button. Watch this video. I'm Tony from Lido Loca, and until the next time, we'll see you on the Lido. Bye.